You can spend 20 years chasing killers and still find one case that keeps you awake every night. For me, it was the man who escaped from a cell that couldn't be opened. New York winters have a way of seeping through the cracks. Even inside the precinct, the chill crawled into your clothes and under your skin. I remember that night clearly. February, 6 a.m. The streets outside empty, but for the occasional rumble of a passing taxi and the distant echo of a siren that never seemed to reach you in time. Inside the prison, the air smelled of disinfectant, dust, and something metallic, the faint tang of tension that comes when people know something has gone very, very wrong. The call came through my radio just as I was finishing my second cup of black coffee. Routine maintenance, they said. Scheduled blackout in Block C, maximum security. 12 minutes. 12 minutes that turned a fortress into a ghost story. When I arrived, the emergency lights were flickering, humming low like some nervous heartbeat in the dark. The guards at the control panel didn't even look at me, their faces pale, eyes darting, not with fear of me, but fear of something far deeper, something unspoken. I could hear the faint clink of handcuffs from the last patrol in the corridor, the metallic groan of reinforced steel, and the occasional distant clang echoing from some far corner of the prison. It all mixed into a symphony of unease, a warning that something unprecedented had occurred. Marcus Vale. The name alone carried weight in the system. 3 counts of first-degree murder, armed robbery, escape from state custody, and a record of manipulation and violence that made officers uneasy to this day. A man who had been through every conceivable security measure and come out with scars and stories that could fill a book. And yet, in 12 minutes, he had done what no one thought possible. He had vanished. I stepped into Block C, running my eyes over every reinforced steel cell, every security camera, every lock. Everything was intact. Nothing had been tampered with. I checked the logs and the maintenance schedules. The outage had been planned, authorized, documented. There were no discrepancies, except the absence of Marcus Vale. I began my walkthrough. The corridor was long, fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting half-shadows on the walls. The faint smell of disinfectant was almost nauseating now, mingling with the sweat and fear on the guards' faces. I could feel the weight of the space pressing down. The concrete walls, the steel bars, the ceiling pipes, all designed to contain men like Vale. And yet, he was gone. How? I asked the nearest guard, a young man named Holloway. He swallowed hard, avoided my gaze. Don't know, detective, he muttered. Lights came back, he was gone. I could feel my pulse quicken, the old instincts kicking in. Every muscle, every thought, every experience I'd had in 20 years of policing told me that this wasn't simple. This wasn't just a lapse. This wasn't bad luck. This was something else, something calculated. I crouched down, running my hand along the cold floor, feeling the uneven tiles, the subtle creaks under the steel frames. I checked every vent I could reach, every drain cover, every panel. Nothing. Not a scratch, not a mark, not a trace of where he could have gone. It was as if he had been plucked from the world and dropped somewhere else entirely. I walked back to the control room. The monitors hummed quietly, flickering to life as the main power returned. I rewound the footage over and over. Nothing. Shadows shifting, emergency lights stuttering, the faint murmur of officers speaking in hushed tones. And then, where Marcus Vale had been, there was nothing. No figure moving, no door opening, no sign of passage, just empty air. I remember looking at the other guards. Their faces, pale and tense, reflected something I couldn't ignore. A secret, a lie, or maybe just fear too heavy to speak aloud. And I thought then, as I often think in moments like these, that the people you trust to maintain order are often the ones who can betray it most quietly. I left the cell block that night with a feeling I hadn't felt since my earliest days on the force. Doubt. Doubt in the system, doubt in the procedures, doubt in my own ability to see through deception. I knew from the first glance at those empty bars that this was going to be a case that changed me, a case that wouldn't let go. And it did. It followed me through the days, weeks, months that came after. It haunted my precinct office, my apartment, my dreams. Because Marcus Vale's disappearance wasn't just an escape, it was a statement. A demonstration that no matter how tight the locks, no matter how high the walls, the system could fail. That's why I'm telling you this story. Not because it ended neatly, not because justice was served, but because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in a neat, solvable package. Sometimes it's messy, impossible, and unforgettable. The first step in understanding what happened is always the same. Trace every moment, every shadow, every whisper. 12 minutes. 12 minutes that tore open the fortress and tore through me. And that's where it begins. At the moment the lights went out, at the moment Marcus Vale ceased to exist where he was supposed to be. The morning after the blackout, the prison smelled different. Not the sharp tang of disinfectant or the steel-cold air, but the quiet tension of disbelief. Every officer I passed on the corridor moved stiffly, eyes avoiding mine, voices clipped and careful. They knew I was coming for answers, and I think some of them already suspected what I would find. I started with the logs. Every entry, every swipe card, every camera feed, I went through them all. Block C was designed to be foolproof. Each cell had a biometric lock, each corridor a camera, each movement a record. Yet when I traced Marcus Vale's last known location, everything was perfect. No anomalies, no door openings, no security breaches. The system had failed in the most impossible way, or someone had bypassed it with intimate knowledge. I pulled in the guards for interviews one by one. Holloway, the young officer, was first. I could tell he was trying to memorize his answers before speaking, but nerves make liars out of everyone. "How long were you stationed in Block C last night?" I asked. Six hours, detective," he stammered. "And during the blackout? I was checking the control panel, like protocol says. Power came back and he was gone." I pressed harder. "Did you see anything unusual? Anything at all?" He shook his head, eyes darting to the floor. But the flicker of hesitation in his voice was enough to tell me he wasn't telling the whole truth. Next was Sergeant Redding. Older, grizzled, the kind of man who had spent decades inside prison walls. I liked him, respected him. He leaned back, lit a cigarette in the break room, the smell harsh and acrid. "Vale," he said, exhaling smoke. "Kid's clever, I'll give him that, but no way he's just gone." I studied his eyes. Fear, embarrassment, or guilt? "Then how?" I asked. "How did he do it?" He shrugged, flicking ash into the sink. "Look, detective, you ever see the way some of these guys study the system? Every routine, every schedule, every guard pattern. He wasn't just studying the prison, he was studying us. All of us. And that was the first real clue. Not a physical trace, not a fingerprint or tool mark, but a pattern. Marcus Vale had observed the system from the inside. He didn't need a tunnel. He didn't need outside help. He needed knowledge, patience, timing. I went to the control room myself. The monitors were still functional, though some cameras had a faint static ripple from the power surge. I replayed the footage minute by minute, frame by frame. Nothing moved, nothing changed, except for the small flicker of light near the southeast corridor, barely perceptible. It was there for less than 2 seconds, and I rewound it a dozen times before realizing it wasn't an anomaly in the camera. It was a shadow, just a shadow, moving without a source. I went back to the cell. The steel was cold under my hands. I pressed and tested, looking for any give. Nothing. Locks intact. Bars unbent. Walls solid. Yet I could feel it. Something in the structure, some flaw we had all overlooked, some microscopic misalignment that Marcus Vale had seen. Interviews with the other officers revealed small inconsistencies. Holloway had been checking the panel, yes, but he reported a minor power fluctuation earlier than the logs indicated. Sergeant Redding had been stationed near the control room, but his movement records didn't match the camera feed. It wasn't proof. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to know someone had seen him go, or someone had helped him without leaving a trace. I moved on to the maintenance logs. The blackout was scheduled for 12 minutes. Routine check on transformers, system calibration. The report said the power would return automatically. Yet the maintenance team's signatures were slightly off. One line missing, another scribbled too quickly. I filed it mentally as a minor discrepancy, but in my experience, minor discrepancies are where major secrets hide. By mid-morning, I was pacing the corridors of Block C again. I could hear the echo of my own boots, the distant clank of a cell door, the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I imagined Vale moving through this block during the blackout, step by step, second by second. I could almost see him calculating every guard rotation, every camera angle, every shadow he could use. He had prepared for this for weeks, maybe months. Then came the first real break. A fellow detective, Marla Jensen, called me in from the city precinct. She'd been reviewing archival reports of past incidents at this prison. Minor escapes, smuggling, protocol breaches. One pattern stood out. During previous blackouts, a single guard consistently recorded slightly inaccurate times in the logs. It wasn't proof of collusion, but it was enough to put someone under scrutiny, and that someone just so happened to be assigned to Block C the night Vale vanished. I stared at the report. The implications hit me like a punch. If this guard had intentionally or accidentally aided Vale, the escape wasn't just clever, it was enabled. It was betrayal from the inside, the kind that corrodes trust and shakes the foundation of every procedure. I called in the officer for a second interview. I wasn't accusatory, not yet. I asked about routines, his night, anything unusual. This time, his answers faltered more than before. He claimed to remember the schedule incorrectly, couldn't recall exact times, avoided eye contact. It wasn't concrete evidence. But in these cases, hesitation speaks louder than facts. By the end of that first day, I had a map of inconsistencies, a web of possible collusion, and a mental reconstruction of Vale's movements during those 12 minutes. Every frame of footage, every step through the corridors, every shadow and flicker had to be accounted for. And yet, even as I pieced it together, I knew there was more. Something subtle, something almost invisible, that made this escape entirely his own. I left the prison that evening with a heavy coat, heavier thoughts, and the gnawing certainty that this case wasn't going to be solved quickly. It was already starting to eat at me. Each interview, each log, each shadow I examined seemed to deepen the puzzle. And somewhere in that block, hidden in plain sight, Marcus Vale had done the impossible. The days after the escape were a blur of paperwork, surveillance reviews, and interviews that seemed to circle in endless loops. I spent hours in the precinct office, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint whir of the filing cabinet fans, and the constant drip of my own coffee into a chipped mug. Every report I read, every log I examined, reminded me that Marcus Vale's disappearance wasn't just an anomaly, it was a calculated, almost surgical act. I started with the guard rotations. Every minute of Block C was documented. Who was where, when they entered and exited, every single swipe of a security card. And yet, when I cross-checked these rotations with camera footage, tiny discrepancies emerged. Nothing obvious, nothing that would stand up in court, but enough to hint that someone's memory or actions didn't match reality. In a prison, even the smallest inconsistency can be exploited by the right person. Vale was exploiting them all. I went back to the camera footage, this time in painstaking detail. Frame by frame, I watched the shadows bend and stretch under the flickering emergency lights. The southeast corridor, the place where Holloway claimed to have been stationed, there was a second shadow I hadn't noticed before. Not moving on its own, not clearly Vale's, but moving with purpose, almost guiding the sequence of events. It lasted less than a second, but that second told a story. Someone had coordinated, someone had helped, or maybe it was Vale alone, using everything at his disposal. I began tracing the guard who had been highlighted in Marla Jensen's review, the one whose logs consistently had minor errors during blackouts. Officer Thompson, 32 years old, quiet, disciplined on the surface. But the pattern in his record was subtle. Blackouts, minor mistakes, shifts in Block C. And now the night Vale vanished, he was on duty. I requested a formal interview. Thompson arrived, posture stiff, hands folded, eyes darting across the room as if scanning for hidden cameras. I asked him about his evening, his patrols, every action taken during the 12 minutes. He responded carefully rehearsed, but every answer seemed incomplete. When I asked if he noticed anything unusual during the blackout, he paused longer than necessary. I could see him calculating, and in that pause I felt it, the first real thread of the escape, the hint of inside knowledge, the glimmer of a betrayal. But even as suspicion grew, I couldn't ignore the physical environment. Block C was supposedly escape-proof. Steel bars reinforced with multiple locks, biometric authentication on every door, cameras covering every angle. So how had Vale moved? I returned to the cell itself, examining every inch. Nothing. Not a dent, not a scratch, not a misaligned lock. Vale had been meticulous, careful, almost obsessive. If anyone else had tried the same, they would have left traces. Vale left nothing. Next, I analyzed the maintenance logs in greater detail. The outage was scheduled, but there were anomalies in the signatures. One minor form had been signed before the official start time. Another signature was smudged, almost as if the pen had been dragged across the paper too fast. Minor things, easily overlooked. But combined with the shadows, the log discrepancies, and Thompson's hesitant answers, it painted a picture. Vale hadn't acted alone, or at least someone had unwittingly enabled him. I also interviewed the maintenance team. A young technician named Perez admitted he'd noticed a small fluctuation in one transformer just before the blackout began. I thought it was nothing, he said, voice small. But maybe it wasn't nothing. He didn't know what he'd just admitted, but I filed it away. Every piece mattered, every tiny clue, because in 12 minutes, Vale had executed something nearly perfect. I revisited Holloway's interview notes. The young officer had reported checking the panel constantly, but minor timestamps didn't match the automated logs. He wasn't lying outright, not yet. But the misalignment suggested distraction, forgetfulness, or perhaps deliberate inattention. Vale could have studied the guard's habits for weeks, watching for moments when attention faltered. It was a chess game, and Vale was already several moves ahead. By the end of the week, I had constructed a preliminary timeline. Every shadow, every patrol, every flicker of light had been accounted for, almost. The 12 minutes stretched into a map of calculated moves. Vale exiting his cell during the blackout, guided either by observation or assistance, moving through corridors with the precision of someone who knew every angle, then disappearing. I also reviewed historical incidents. Small, seemingly insignificant breaches that had occurred in the prison over the past 5 years. Each one was minor. A door left open for a minute, a maintenance panel unlocked, a camera that failed briefly. Individually, they were insignificant. Taken together, they revealed a pattern, a system that could be manipulated. And Vale had learned it all, mastered it all, and executed the escape flawlessly. It wasn't just methodical, it was personal. I could feel his presence in the planning, the way he had observed every human, every procedure, every predictable behavior. He wasn't just escaping the prison. He was proving a point. The system could be bent, the rules could be broken, and all it took was patience and intellect. That realization hit me harder than any physical evidence could. I had spent years relying on protocol, procedure, and the assumption that people would act as expected. Vale shattered that assumption in 12 minutes. And the longer I stared at the blank cell, the more I understood. The escape wasn't just clever, it was perfect. By the second week after the escape, it was clear that staying confined to the prison's walls wasn't enough. Vale didn't just vanish from Block C, he vanished from New York itself, at least in the ways we could track him. I needed to look beyond the steel bars, beyond the cameras, beyond the guards and the logs. I needed to look at every connection, every habit, every pattern that Marcus Vale might exploit once he was outside the prison gates. I started with his associates, the people who had survived past crimes with him, the minor players who'd helped him avoid capture before. The first phone call I made was to Victor Santos, a former accomplice turned low-level informant. Victor answered on the second ring, voice hesitant, tinged with fear. "You're calling about him," he said before I even spoke. "Yes," I said. "Tell me everything you know, every meeting, every plan, every contact Vale might have had." There was a long silence. Then, quietly, "He always had a network. You didn't know, you couldn't know, but he had people who could move shadows for him." Victor wasn't exaggerating. Vale had spent years studying not only prisons but human behavior, leverage points, loyalty, weaknesses, small favors owed, debts unpaid. I realized then that we weren't just chasing a man, we were chasing a spider across a city of shadows, and every thread mattered. Next, I pulled in every record of his prior movements. Bank transactions before his incarceration, phone calls to family, visits from lawyers. Nothing jumped out at first. Every transaction was routine, every call logged. But patterns are deceptive. When you zoom in, minutiae form a roadmap. Vale had sent tiny coded messages through lawyers, through deposit slips, through minor, almost invisible acts. I could see it now. Even behind bars, he was setting the stage for this escape, planning months in advance. The first breakthrough came in a minor detail I almost overlooked: a maintenance supply order. It was routine paperwork, an order for replacement transformer parts in Block C. But one of the serial numbers had been mismatched, a minor clerical error that placed the wrong component in the Southeast Corridor transformer. I traced the supplier. The shipping manifest was correct, the delivery verified, but someone had swapped the components without recording it. It was subtle, invisible to most, but for Vale, it created the perfect window, a momentary exploitable glitch during the blackout. I took the evidence to my team. Some were skeptical, brushing it off as coincidence, but I knew better. When multiple small discrepancies converge at the same time, logs, shadows, maintenance, guards inconsistencies, you're no longer seeing coincidences, you're seeing a plan unfold. Then came the witness tip. A cab driver named Malik called in, reporting a man matching Vale's description seen near the industrial district that night. The driver insisted he had picked up a passenger from a route that didn't exist, a street under construction, blocked off. Vale wasn't flagged in any traffic records, any surveillance cameras, any known vehicle, and yet the cabbie swore he'd seen him, exiting into the shadows, disappearing into an alley. It was the first concrete trace of life outside the prison walls. I retraced that area myself the next morning. The industrial district smelled of oil, rust, and damp brick. Every dumpster, every shuttered doorway, every alleyway could hide a man like Vale. The city itself became a labyrinth, and as I walked, I felt the old thrill of the hunt, the combination of fear, intellect, and adrenaline that comes when a criminal is smart enough to challenge every assumption you've ever made. Next, I began cross-referencing his former contacts with recent events. Bail bondsmen, former accomplices, anyone who had access to transport, safe houses, or falsified records. Patterns emerged. Small businesses that hadn't been audited in years, storage facilities with minimal oversight, night workers with no official documentation. Vale's world had always existed in these gray spaces, outside official notice, just beyond the law's grasp. And now, after 12 minutes, he had merged back into it. I called in a forensic analyst to examine the transformer component from Block C. He discovered a tiny, almost imperceptible modification. Vale had used it to create a brief power fluctuation during the blackout, enough to mask his movements from the cameras, but short enough to leave no lasting damage. It was brilliant. I had to admire it, even as anger gnawed at me. The man had outsmarted every safeguard we relied on. Over the next few days, I spent long hours in the field, checking cab records, interviewing former associates, retracing industrial alleyways, reviewing maintenance protocols. Every lead I chased seemed to split into 2, 3, or 4 more paths. Vale had anticipated this. He had calculated that the system would respond in patterns we thought predictable, and each predictable move had been used against us. Then, the first unmistakable connection emerged. A delivery driver had unknowingly transported a crate from a warehouse linked to one of Vale's prior associates. Inside, a cache of survival gear, disguises, and forged identification. Everything a man would need to disappear from New York City quickly. The pieces were fitting together. Not only had Vale escaped the cell block, he had prepared months in advance to vanish into the urban landscape, relying on shadows, misdirection, and the smallest cracks in the system. It was at that moment, standing in the middle of a deserted warehouse, smelling the damp brick and oil, that I realized the truth. Vale hadn't just escaped from prison. He had engineered a disappearance so elegant, so perfectly timed, that it challenged the very notion of containment. And I knew something else too. The investigation was only beginning. Because if Vale had prepared this meticulously for months while behind bars, who knew what he might do next? And who, inside the prison or out, had helped him, deliberately or accidentally, to accomplish it? By the 3rd week of the investigation, it was clear that Marcus Vale hadn't acted alone, or at least he hadn't needed to. The evidence, subtle but undeniable, pointed to someone inside Block C, someone whose routine, oversight, or small mistakes had created the perfect opening. I needed to find the person, and that meant looking at every guard, every officer, every maintenance worker who had touched that corridor in the past 6 months. I started with Officer Thompson, the one whose logs repeatedly misaligned with the system. I brought him into a private interview room, the kind that makes you feel the walls are closing in. The faint smell of old coffee and paper filled the air, mixing with the subtle, nervous sweat that clung to every human being under stress. I leaned forward. "Thompson, I need the truth, not guesses. Not stories, facts. What happened in Block C the night Vale disappeared?" He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the door, as if considering escape. I don't know what you mean, Detective," he said. But there was hesitation. There was fear. There was guilt. His pulse throbbed visibly in his neck, and I recognized it. Instinctively, after decades in law enforcement, he was hiding something. I went over the sequence again slowly. Every detail from the logs, the cameras, the maintenance, the shadows, and the whispers I'd gathered. Each fact I laid on the table weighed on him like a hammer. Then, after a long pause, he muttered almost inaudibly, Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Not enough, not even close. But it was a crack in the wall, a tiny opening to probe further. I pressed, asking about unusual activity, odd behaviors, anything out of the ordinary. And the story started to emerge, slow and painful, like peeling back layers of steel. Thompson admitted to seeing something odd that night. A shadow moving faster than it should have, a glint of light where no one should have been. He hadn't realized it at the time, hadn't acted, hadn't called anyone. He said he felt conflicted, afraid to overstep, afraid to be wrong. But he hadn't been afraid enough to notice the small detail that mattered. Vale had positioned a minor piece of equipment in exactly the right spot to manipulate the emergency power system. And Thompson, distracted, had overlooked it. It wasn't betrayal in the malicious sense, not yet. It was negligence born of human error. But in the system Vale had studied so carefully, negligence was all he needed. 12 minutes of darkness, one distracted officer, a flawed transformer, and Marcus Vale was gone. I moved on to interview Sergeant Redding again, the grizzled veteran who had leaned on me in the first week. I wanted context. He confirmed that Thompson had been distracted during the blackout, but he also hinted at an unspoken tension, a history of minor conflicts, a rivalry that had left Thompson wary, hesitant, overly cautious. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was context, and context can guide intuition. Next, I scrutinized Holloway, the young officer. I wanted to see if he had noticed anything unusual, anything he might have dismissed. And after careful questioning, he admitted to seeing Vale glance toward him just before the power went out. A momentary, calculated look, assessing him. He hadn't understood its significance at the time, but Vale had been studying everyone, calculating reactions, exploiting patterns. Holloway's inexperience hadn't helped. It had created opportunity. Then came the breakthrough that tied the threads together. A security camera in a hallway, not previously reviewed, showed a faint, fleeting reflection of Vale's face in a maintenance panel glass. It lasted less than a second, but paired with Thompson's oversight, it painted a clear picture. Vale had used the blackout, the momentary lapse, and his knowledge of human behavior to slip past everything. It was both brilliant and terrifying. He had studied human error as meticulously as physical barriers. The perfect escape didn't require collusion. It required understanding, patience, and timing. And while Thompson's oversight was small, it had been enough. I called in my team and laid it out, step by step, reconstruction by reconstruction. The timeline, Vale exiting the cell, moving through corridors, exploiting guard rotations, utilizing the transformer to mask camera glitches. It all fit together. The pieces of the puzzle were there. And yet, even as we traced it, I knew something remained hidden. A subtlety, a nuance that even the logs and cameras couldn't capture. Vale had prepared for contingencies. He had planned for mistakes, and he had made sure the system itself became part of the escape. That night I returned to Block C alone, walking the corridor slowly, the cold pressing against my jacket, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. I imagined Vale moving through this space, precise, deliberate, calm, calculating every heartbeat and every reaction. And for the first time I understood that the man wasn't just intelligent, he was dangerous on a different level. Not brute strength or weapons, but intellect, patience, and psychological mastery. I left the prison with a heavy weight in my chest. Inside, I had the first suspect, the inside link. Negligence, distraction, and unintentional opening. Outside, the trail was still cold, shadows stretching across the city where Vale could be anywhere untraceable. I felt the old adrenaline, the thrill mixed with dread, the awareness that I had stepped into something bigger than any single clue or suspect. The hunt had only just begun. By the fourth week, it was clear that solving this case wouldn't be about simply watching camera footage or reviewing logs anymore. Marcus Vale had slipped into the city itself, and New York, with all its alleys, abandoned warehouses, and labyrinthine streets, was his playground. We were chasing a ghost, a man who had planned every step, studied every potential flaw, and anticipated every reaction. I began with the cab records. Every trip within a 2-mile radius of the prison during the hours immediately following the blackout was logged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. The first credible lead came from Malik, the cab driver who had reported seeing Vale near the industrial district. I retraced the streets myself, walking slowly along cracked pavement, smelling the faint scent of oil, rust, and damp brick, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional scrape of a dumpster lid in an alley. The area was quiet, almost too quiet, and I realized quickly that Vale thrived in these spaces, places that the city considered dead, forgotten, or unmonitored. Next, I checked surveillance outside warehouses, small storefronts, and even delivery docks. I looked for patterns, not actions, repetitive movements, the same van or truck appearing near different locations, minor interactions that seemed coincidental but weren't. It was tedious, painstaking work. Every moment I watched, I could almost feel Vale's presence in the city, manipulating, hiding, waiting. It was like following a shadow that knew I was chasing it. Then, the first tangible evidence appeared. A warehouse security camera, previously overlooked, caught a fleeting glimpse of a man fitting Vale's description entering with a delivery crew just hours after the escape. He was careful, methodical, not hurried, not reckless. It confirmed what I'd suspected. Vale had a network outside the prison, minor accomplices who could move unnoticed, people he had studied and manipulated long before he disappeared from Block C. I tracked the delivery manifests, cross-referencing employee names, van registration numbers, and shipping destinations. A pattern emerged. The same company had made shipments to multiple warehouses across the city, none officially documented, all registered under front names. Vale had built a web, a small but reliable network to facilitate escape and survival. I interviewed former associates of Vale, people who had assisted him in minor thefts and cons before. Most were cagey, unwilling to speak on record, their eyes darting nervously whenever his name was mentioned. But fragments of information pieced together revealed safe houses, hidden storage units, and trusted contacts. Vale had prepared contingencies. If one location was compromised, he could move seamlessly to another. He had thought of every variable, every what-if, every potential obstacle. One particularly promising lead came from a dry-cleaning clerk. A man matching Vale's description had dropped off a set of suits, asking for alterations that included hidden pockets and reinforced seams. The transaction was cash only, no records beyond a scribbled note in the receipt book. It wasn't much, but it was something. Every minor detail mattered, and here was proof that Vale was preparing for life outside the prison. Disguises, mobility, the tools he needed to blend in. I began constructing a citywide timeline. The blackout at Block C, Vale's movements through the industrial district, his brief sightings, and the delivery network that would allow him to remain invisible. Each piece reinforced the picture of a man who wasn't just escaping from a prison, but disappearing entirely into an urban environment that offered him freedom, anonymity, and opportunity. During one long night, I revisited the warehouse district, retracing the cab driver's route, noting surveillance cameras, alleyways, and abandoned structures. The city smelled of asphalt, damp brick, and exhaust, a mixture that masked other odors but also held the faint trace of human activity. I imagined Vale moving through this maze, blending shadows with shadows, timing each step, avoiding cameras, and exploiting the smallest gaps in attention. It was both exhilarating and unnerving. The more I studied, the more I realized I was following a man who was always one step ahead. The breakthrough came in an unexpected place, a small storage facility, previously registered under a business that had long since dissolved. The manager, an elderly man with twitchy eyes and a low voice, remembered a man fitting Vale's description renting Unit 12 just 2 days before the prison blackout. The unit contained crates of supplies, clothing, food, minor tools, and maps of city streets marked in a way that suggested careful planning. It was the first time I could visualize Vale outside the prison. Not a ghost, not a fleeting shadow, but a man preparing, consolidating, and moving. By piecing together all the leads, the cabbie, the warehouse entries, the safe houses, the minor accomplices, a clear pattern emerged. Vale's escape wasn't just an accident or a moment of negligence by a distracted officer. It was the culmination of months, if not years, of preparation. Every misstep, every small opportunity, every weakness in the system had been studied, anticipated, and exploited. And I understood as the city lights glimmered across the skyline that night that the hunt was only beginning. The inside link had given him the moment. The city offered him the space. And somewhere in the sprawling urban maze, Marcus Vale was alive, moving, watching, and calculating his next steps. By the 5th week, I had a clearer picture of Marcus Vale than anyone else in the city. I knew his patterns, his network, and the shadows he moved through. But knowing and catching are two entirely different beasts. Vale wasn't just a criminal. He was a strategist, a thinker, a man who had spent his life exploiting the cracks in the system. Every move I planned had to account for his foresight. The first real breakthrough came from a minor surveillance camera near an old warehouse in Brooklyn. A grainy image, time-stamped late evening, showed a man entering, carrying what looked like a duffel bag. The posture, the stride, the slight tilt of the head, unmistakable. Marcus Vale. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a plan. I coordinated with a small team, keeping it tight. Too many eyes would scatter the shadows. We staked out the area, blending into the night. The streets smelled of damp asphalt, refuse, and the faint tang of diesel. Neon signs flickered, their light catching the occasional glint of a puddle. It was the kind of city night where a man like Vale could disappear in seconds. And I knew he could see us too. He always knew, always anticipated. Hours passed. We watched the warehouse, the entrances, the fire escapes. Every sound seemed amplified. A distant siren, the scrape of metal, the hiss of a subway vent. Then, finally, a figure emerged from a side door, walking with precision, carrying 2 duffel bags. He paused, glanced around, calculated, patient, aware. Vale? I held my breath. The team remained still, and I watched him move across the lot toward a nondescript van. Every step measured, almost rehearsed. It was a test, a game he was playing, and he knew I was watching. We followed in cars, careful to maintain distance. Vale didn't rush. He didn't make mistakes. He drove, not fast, not slow, just enough to blend in with the evening traffic, to remain unremarkable. But the longer we trailed him, the more I realized the depth of his planning. Every route had a contingency. Every alley, every bridge, every highway exit was pre-calculated. Finally, he stopped at a small apartment block in Queens, one that didn't appear in any official records. He exited, carrying one of the duffel bags, and disappeared into the stairwell. I called in a tactical unit quietly, trying to anticipate his next move without alerting him. We secured the perimeter, listening to the faint echoes of his footsteps in the building. Inside, the apartment was sparse but meticulously arranged. Maps of the city, surveillance notes, multiple disguises, all signs of a mind obsessed with preparation. And in the center of it all, Marcus Vale sat calmly, almost expectant, as if he had been waiting for me to arrive. "Detective," he said, voice even, eyes sharp, assessing me the way a chess player studies an opponent. "I was wondering when you'd find me." I studied him, noting every micro-expression, every subtle sign of stress or overconfidence. Vale had been behind bars, yet he had thought 10 moves ahead of everyone else for months. And now, here he was, like a predator, calmly observing the prey that had dared to follow him. We talked, not in accusations, not in threats, but in observation, in testing each other. He revealed almost nothing, yet everything. The escape, the planning, the manipulation of human behavior, all hinted at in offhand comments, subtle truths wrapped in casual tones. and I understood fully the breadth of his intellect and the danger it posed. It became clear to catch him, I couldn't just react. I had to anticipate, to outthink, to force him into a situation where his own perfection became his weakness. Every step forward was a game of psychology, of patience, of predicting the unpredictable. And for the first time since the escape, I felt a surge of exhilaration. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a contest, mind versus mind, strategy versus strategy. As I left the apartment that night, the city alive with distant sirens, honking horns, and the occasional shout, I realized something crucial. Vale had escaped Block C flawlessly, navigated the city with precision, and survived entirely on intellect and anticipation. But even the best prepared minds have limits, and every network, every shadow, every hidden supply line is a vulnerability. I just needed to find it first, and I would. It took another week of surveillance, citywide coordination, and painstaking analysis to finally pin down Vale's next move. By now, I had a mental map of his movements, his network, and his habits. Everything down to the small pauses he took while checking the streets, the routes he preferred, the timing of his pickups. I knew he was meticulous, patient, and brilliant, and yet even brilliance has a limit. The final lead came from a seemingly inconsequential tip. A dry-cleaning clerk in Queens recognized a man matching Vale's description, dropping off a freshly altered suit with reinforced pockets. The clerk had kept the receipt, scribbled in pencil, almost forgotten. That single piece of paper pointed me to a small, abandoned industrial building on the edge of the city, a location Vale had been observed near before. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't high-tech, but for Vale it was perfect, isolated, inconspicuous, and easily defended. We moved in quietly, tactical team in place, perimeter secured. The air smelled of damp concrete, rust, and lingering chemicals. Inside, shadows clung to the walls, stretching across crates and forgotten machinery. Every echo of a footstep, every creak of metal, became amplified in the silence. Vale was here, and I knew it. I called his name softly, letting the sound echo in the cavernous space. No response. I moved forward cautiously, flashlight cutting swaths of white through the darkness. Then, from behind a stack of crates, a figure emerged, calm, confident, every movement deliberate. Marcus Vale. "Detective," he said, voice low, almost conversational. "You've done your homework. Impressive." I studied him, noting every subtle twitch, every micro-expression. Vale had spent months anticipating attention, watching for eyes on him. Yet here he was, still confident, yet I could feel the faint tension beneath the surface, the careful control he maintained over his own reactions. We circled each other in that space, exchanging words that were more testing than conversation. I probed, he deflected, each sentence a subtle psychological duel. I had learned enough about him now to understand his motives. Not greed, not malice, but mastery, intellect, and the satisfaction of proving that he could outthink everyone else. The escape had been more than freedom. It had been a challenge, a statement. I offered him a choice, a way out that preserved a semblance of control for him. Vale studied the offer, weighing probabilities, outcomes, contingencies. For the first time I saw doubt in his eyes, a flicker, brief and almost imperceptible, and that flicker was enough. It broke the rhythm of his confidence, just enough for me to close the gap. The confrontation was tense but contained. No gunfire, no dramatic chase, no shouting, just the careful orchestration of anticipation, patience, and strategy. Vale understood he had been outmaneuvered not through force but through knowledge, observation, and relentless persistence. He surrendered almost reluctantly, the same calm intelligence in his eyes, yet now tempered with the acknowledgement that the game was over. As I led him away through the streets he had once manipulated, I felt a complex mix of emotions: exhilaration, relief, respect, and a subtle unease. Vale was brilliant, too brilliant, and the escape, the planning, the execution, it would linger in my mind for years. It was a testament to human intellect, patience, and audacity, and a haunting reminder that even the best systems can be challenged. Back at the precinct, processing the arrest, I reviewed the case files once more. Every discrepancy, every misstep, every opportunity Vale had exploited was recorded, analyzed, and cataloged. The city, the prison, the human operators within it, all had contributed to the perfection of the escape. And yet, even now, as I watched him sit calmly in the holding cell, I knew the story wasn't entirely over. Vale had left a mark on the system, a trail of lessons that could not be erased. Later that night, as I walked the empty streets of New York, the city alive with distant sirens, traffic, and the faint hum of neon lights, I reflected on the case. 12 minutes. 12 minutes that had upended the order I had trusted for decades. A lesson in observation, patience, and the fine line between preparation and obsession. And somewhere in my mind, I could almost hear him calculating, planning, already imagining the next challenge. A mind that refused to stop thinking, even in confinement. In the end, justice was served in the traditional sense. Vale was back behind bars. But the psychological and strategic mastery he displayed would stay with me forever. A reminder that sometimes the greatest adversaries are not the loud, the violent, or the obvious, but the quiet, calculated, and brilliant. And as I returned to my office, the city stretching endlessly before me, I understood a final truth. Some cases never truly end. They linger in the mind, shaping the way you see people, systems, and the delicate balance between order and chaos. Marcus Vale had escaped once, and even though he was caught again, the memory of his mind, his audacity, his perfection, would never leave me.